Welcome to all of you at this early evening NIAS talk at Spui 25 online, that is. Today we have a very special and important topic that will be discussed by some very highly esteemed speakers, which I will whom I will introduce in a bit. The NIAS talk of tonight deals with commoning practices by newcomers in urban areas and how they self-organize. And we will discuss the concepts of spatial justice. This topic is already elaborated upon in depth today during the workshop organized by Professor Maria Kaika, who has initiated a huge project. I will introduce her in a bit. And this workshop has taken place today. And so they have had a long day, but it is very special for us to be the first to learn from their insights and some of the first results that came from this workshop. So tonight I will first introduce Maria Kaika. She's a professor of urban, regional and environmental planning at the University of Amsterdam. And she's also just started in April 2020 as the director of the Center for Urban Studies at the University of Amsterdam. And her research focuses on three interrelated themes: urban political ecology, cities and crises, and urban radical imaginaries. And we were very happy to have Maria Kaika as our NIAS fellow in the year group of 2019 and 2020, where she researched depth as biopolitics. Our second speaker of today, and he will give the keynote of tonight, is professor at COMPAS, the University of Oxford Centre on Migration, Policy and Society. And he is also the director of the Peak Urban Research Program, which aims to aid decision-making on urban futures. Michael Keith is coordinator of urban transformations and co-director of the Oxford Program for the Future of Cities. And in his talk, he will elaborate more on migrant mobilities in contemporary metropolis. Our two respondents of tonight are Savderoglou. He is a Marie Curie Fellow at the Department of Human Geography, Planning and International Development at the University of Amsterdam, and he's a postdoctoral researcher at the Department of Planning and Regional Development at the University of Thessaly. And his research interests include critical urban theory, autonomy and migration, and intersectional, decolonial and affective geographies. Our second respondent of tonight is Marca Valenta. She is an assistant professor at University College in Utrecht, and she's working on the intersection of politics, anthropology, and history. And Marca Valenta is, this year, she is our Urban Citizen Fellow. This is a fellowship at NIAS, the Netherlands Institute for Advanced Study. And this fellowship is a very specific one. It is supported by the municipality of Amsterdam, and the fellowship is meant to foster and encourage research on topics of urban citizenship and all the challenges, opportunities, possibilities, and pitfalls that come with that. So we are very happy that our two fellows, Maria Kaika and Marca Valenta, today are able to discuss their findings. Today, this session, this seminar of tonight, the program is as follows. We will start with a brief introduction of the full research program of which the workshop today and the NIAS talk tonight is a part. Maria Kaika will give the introduction. Then we have a 40-minute keynote given by Michael Keith. And then Savderoglou and Marca Valenta will briefly respond in both 5 minutes. And then we have 30 minutes for a panel discussion in which all of you are very much welcome to pose your questions in the Q&A. And you can, below on your screen below, you can see a Q&A button. So you can post your questions there, and I will see and try to gather some questions and bring them into the panel discussion. Let me welcome Maria Kaika and start the talk. Maria, can you please show yourself? Thank you, Maria. Welcome.
Many thanks, Fanneke, and many thanks to NIAS and SPO25 for helping us organize this event. It's this evening, as Fanneke noted, concludes a marathon workshop at NIAS that Savderoglou and I co-organized, and Michael Keith also participated. In the workshop, we wanted to document, and in the research project, to document newcomers as active agents of social, political, economic, and even environmental change, as people who destabilize international territorial certainties as they cross borders, as pioneers who challenge international agreements as they push onwards to their final destinations, as activists who dispute local institutional practices when they intervene and change the standards of living conditions in camps, when they organize collective forms of cooking, education, and care. But also many newcomers in Istanbul, Belgrade, Athens, Paris, Amsterdam decline the provision of food and shelter in marginalized camp locations and move to city centers. Many occupy buildings, become insurgent citizens, and establish new forms of collective housing, socialization, work, and art. Their claim to the city is much more than what Lefebvre defined as the right to the city. It is much more than just a claim to freedom, playfulness, or sociability. Their claim is the right to co-create the city's life and economy, to co-create the city's history, to be able to change that fossilized socio-geological formation that we call the Western city. I often like to think of cities like that, like a fossilized palimpsest of historical layers of investment of capital generated from a relentless quest for profit across the world. Think of Amsterdam's beautiful canal houses. Think of them as sponges that have absorbed over the centuries layer upon layer of profit extracted from exploited natural resources, but also from laboring bodies of men and women, not only here, but also in Suriname, Ghana, India, Angola, Senegal, South Africa, Indonesia, the world. In ports, mines, oil rigs, breweries, cigarette and biscuit factories, windmills, tulip plantations. Each time a new real estate transaction takes place in Amsterdam, fresh amounts of profit extracted from labor and resources across the world sink once again into that particular pile of bricks. So when newcomers occupy flats in city centers, they claim a stake in inhabiting and changing this particular history that has weaved together labor, resources, and profit-making under Western capitalism and colonialism. They make a claim to adding their own underpaid and precarious labor to the history of the labor that produces this city. They lay a claim in inhabiting and changing this history, and by doing so, newcomers enter, of course, in direct competition with local property owners, developers, luxury retail, Airbnb economies, who wish to sell this same history to the highest bidder. So the newcomers' right to the city, we understand it as a right to weave their own labor and their own stories into the city's local and colonial histories of labor, resources, and capital. It is a claim to add a new layer to that fossilized socio-geological formation that we call the Western city. And in their act of producing these new layers of urbanity, these new narratives, newcomers challenge established institutions, economies, policies, actors, ways of doing, ways of living. To succeed in this challenge, they need neither our sympathy nor, of course, our hostility or racism. Both sympathy and hostility can be seen as two sides of the same coin. Both sympathy and hostility are affective, but ultimately apolitical reactions, emotions without politics. What the force of change that newcomers can bring to our cities, what that needs to thrive is commoning practices, is politics. They need co-workers to co-create alternative urban imaginaries and materialities. They need co-creators of new, more inclusive layers of urbanity, new, more inclusive stories of urbanity that can have the power to change urban economies, societies, and environments in the future. And with this concluding remark, I want to pass the floor to Michael Keith, who will give his keynote, and I'm sure he will add much more depth and context to my brief comments. Thank you.
Wonderful, Maria. Thank you so much. Michael, I would like to welcome you on stage so you can put on your camera. Welcome, Michael. Great to have you here. You can start sharing your screen, and I will mute myself.
Is that okay?
Wonderful, thank you. Yeah.
Just tell me when to start. And
yeah, you can start right now, Michael.
Okay. Thank you, and many thanks to the organisers for both the workshop that some people won't have had the chance to attend, but also for those people who are giving up their evening today to come to the talk. I want to ask, how should we think about the tensions between democracy, the rights of citizenship, and the global flows of humanity that we see today moving to the cities of the 21st century? And I want to begin with Hannah Arendt, an extraordinary figure. Writing in 1943, Hannah Arendt commented that we don't like to be called refugees. There is not and never was any club founded by Hitler-persecuted people that indicated its members were refugees. Arendt's writing was always powerful and evocative. She wrote at times of global turmoil and personal catastrophe, of the dilemmas of the displaced, all strangely familiar to the pandemic present. In her 1943 essay, she moves between the longue durée of history, that long-term sensibility, and the exigencies of the here and now. For Arendt, to be a Jew in 1943 was to face the impossible alternatives right now in a particular place, of either being a conscious pariah, accepting this status of an outsider, or a pretender, what she called a parvenu, embracing the hypocrisies and lies of assimilation proven over many centuries. Her sense of how displaced humanity lands in place and assumes a geography of settlement and displaces cartographies of mobility is accompanied by an associated disruption in the sense of temporality, how time moves. She said, even among ourselves, we don't speak about the past. Instead, we found our own way of making and mastering an uncertain future. Knowable histories, unreliable memories, fictitious futures, they all structure both the sensibility of the refugee, but also the political imagination that qualifies how we might think about democracy and citizenship today. The influential and cerebral political theorist Giorgio Agamben took Arendt's essay as axiomatic, transforming Hannah Arendt's particular condition into a new universal. In his words, given the now unstoppable decline of the nation state and the general corrosion of traditional political juridical categories, the refugee is perhaps the only thinkable figure for the people of our time and the only category in which one may see today, at least until the process of dissolution of the nation state and of its sovereignty has achieved full completion, the forms and limits of a coming political community. Until the process of dissolution of the nation state. Well, yes, maybe. I admire much of what Agamben has written, and many of his concepts have become influential with audiences that cross academic circles and civil society networks alike. But there is always a but. In the here and now of Europe in 2021 and the cities of the 21st century, we need to address moral dilemmas that are complex, with tactics that are effective, strategies that are far-sighted, and a geographical imagination that is global. Agamben critiques the hypocrisies of citizenship, and more particularly the hypocrisies of theories of citizenship and the exclusions of regimes of citizenship that are practiced in the contemporary world. He contrasts such a critique with the importance of recognizing a more universal humanity, the bare life out of which the human condition is patterned. All of this is powerful and original stuff. But more recently, alongside his controversial interventions on how the COVID pandemic instrumentalizes and legitimizes a surveillance state, he has also taken principled positions that include an objection to the granting of citizenship to Italians born to parents of foreign origins. If citizenship is a badge of hypocrisy, then for Agamben it appears that all might be excluded from it. Arendt started from what was for her the here and now. Agamben begins and ends in a land of high principle. This is an important difference. And in part, I want to work through today how it is possible to see how axes of time and space reconstruct our sense of a political imagination. Time and space are not outside the imagination, they are constitutive of it. There is a time and place for utopian thinking, and there is a time and place for political action. They're not always the same. Registers of the temporal and cartographies of the spatial construct our ways of thinking, in particular in a global context of mobilities and flows at a time of great uncertainty. We talk at a time when the city becomes a site of hope. The notion of the city commons, as Maria was talking about, it invokes a political project that might finally help us think differently about mutual obligations, shared futures, and the imperatives of hospitality. So my talk today is structured through a global quick tour, 7 paradoxes, 7 snapshots of migrant claims to the city and the commons across the globe. In these snapshots, I choose to stand closer to Arendt than to Agamben, to start from a recognition of the uncertainties and contradictions that define the paradoxes of everyday life. The conference today took its lead from the powerful invocation of le droit à la vie that is rooted in the situationist activist of the Parisian 1960s, Henri Lefebvre, and his inspirational but occasionally loose framing of the claims he made on urban life in the name of the right to the city. Lefebvre's work has inspired some of the greatest geographers of recent generations and some of the most powerful writing on cities. I've used his material frequently, as have some of the authors I most admire. But in spite of actually welcoming the notion of the right to the city in very many ways, there are some problems when we think through the dynamics of the international movement of people through a lens that privileges the right to the city over other framings of migration and mobility. Because we might start from a recognition that the democratic and liberal traditions are not singular, but occupy different geographies and histories of political thought. These domains of the liberal and the democratic political thought are in some ways and sometimes incommensurable. They exist in abstract contradictory relationship to each other, institutionally and empirically, in agonistic relations, on the ground and in the here and now. For Chantal Mouffe, she puts it this way, that democratic logics always entail a drawing of a frontier between us and them, those who belong to the demos and those who are outside it. This is the condition for the very exercise of democratic rights. It necessarily creates a tension with the liberal emphasis on the respect of human rights, since there is no guarantee that a decision made through democratic procedures will not jeopardize some existing rights. This talk is about how we map, navigate, and narrate these agonistic landscapes. Migration and mobility provides a lens through which their contradictions, contingencies, and precarities are made visible to analytical scrutiny and political and practical action. The appeal is to a sense of an ethics that is complex, contradictory, and confusing, and perhaps also to a politics that is less utopian and slightly more pragmatic than some may consider appropriate. And I want to begin with the first of the 7 paradoxes when we think about the migration to the cities of Northern Europe in the late 20th century, which in many ways have commonalities that share the Netherlands' experience with that of the United Kingdom, but also of Germany and France. the Gastarbeiter, the movement from the Caribbean eastwards, the movement from North Africa northwards. The truth is that there's been a long-standing debate about the extent to which those migrations were economically beneficial or not in a number of quarters. But the truth is also the case that one of the dirty secrets of the migration of the late 20th century, which is common pretty much universally, is that migrants are cheap. They tend to come schooled and skilled, and they tend to come to contribute to labor forces. They tend almost overwhelmingly, if you look at the European experience, the last 50 years of the 20th century, to be economically beneficial. But those benefits don't flow equally. In fact, the most striking thing, that as the economists would put it, the externalities, the unintended costs and the unintended benefits of migration flow at two different geographical scales. The unintended costs, the negative externalities of migration tend to flow at the scale at which people live, the level of the neighborhood. The benefits of migration accrue at a different geographical scale, that of the labor market, the city, or even the nation. So there's a tension depending on what lens we are looking through when we think about the neighborhood or the city, one alongside each other, to understand what was going on for much of the late 20th century, not least when people arrived in the cities of Northern Europe, to find that the right to work, notwithstanding the fact that in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the right to a home, the right to housing, was in the 25th article of the 1948 Declaration. The right to work was not always matched with a right to dwell. People had to struggle to find somewhere to dwell in the cities of the North, as we'll come back to. So there's a relational sense in which those scales of the neighborhood and the scales of the city have to be understood alongside each other perspectively. It's not particularly unique in many ways to the cities of Northern Europe. But it was in Northern Europe that you see the incidental benefits of migration accruing at one geographical scale, the economic benefits at another. And that sense of the relationality between the two might take us just briefly through to China, where in 2009, I began a project that lasted about 7 years before producing a book with my colleagues, Scott Lash, Jacob Arnoldi, and Tyler Rooker, which looked at a number of things. But as part of that project, I spent several months living in the city of Shenzhen, which is an incredible place that grew on the borders of Hong Kong, Shanghai, from about 280,000 people in 1978 to somewhere between 15 and 20 million people today, an extraordinary rate of growth. And where I learned very poor Mandarin and interviewed a couple of hundred migrants who'd moved to the city. They moved to the city largely from the countryside, but then their membership of the city, their right to the city, was strictly limited by the hukou regime in China, which means that their welfare rights in order to get access for education for their kids, to health for themselves, for some sort of insurance, that tended to belong huijia. Back home, the hukou extended not necessarily to the city of Shenzhen or many other cities in China. So the surplus population, what sometimes is talked about as the Nongmingong or Liangong Renko, the floating population of China, actually moved to the cities like Shenzhen, but they then found themselves in effectively kind of warehouse developments like this in the neighborhood of Jiasha. Now, the neighborhoods of Shenzhen are actually frequently known as the Chongjunsuen, which is in English is the villages in the middle of the city, or it's actually city middle village in terms of direct translation of the Mandarin. Because in China, property rights are different between rural areas and urban areas. In urban areas, all of the land belongs to the city. In rural areas, effectively the land belongs in an almost more Western style to the clan or the village. And the villages still exist legally within Shenzhen, which means that you have small stock companies now that are entirely democratic. They have shareholders. The shareholders are the old village members. And those village members have built places like these tower blocks in Jiasha, which according to Harvard University 15 years ago was the most dense form of urban development outside the West Bank on the planet Earth, if you use satellite measures. They're known locally as Wushufang, handshake apartments, quite literally because you can lean out of one window and shake the hand of somebody else. The truth is that these democratic structures, these small stock companies, created these warehousing forms of urban life that were incredibly productive for Shenzhen in the early days when mass numbers of unskilled labor was needed. But as Shenzhen moved up the value chain, you see a process of gentrification China style. Well, whereas these buildings used to have one family in each room, suddenly students began to occupy more than one room, even when they came through on their own. And by the time one got to the 1990s and early 2000s, as Shenzhen moved further up the value chain, and the city used to claim it had more PhDs in Shenzhen than in the rest of China put together, an urban myth, which is quite powerful in its own way. The new skills that were needed were matched with a redevelopment of areas like this in Jiaxia, with a large plot handed over to Vanke by the stock company, by the villagers themselves, who in the anthropologist Helen Su's terms had suddenly changed from cultivating crops to cultivating real estate. What it actually meant was that it highlighted the fact that what we often think of as together in some way, the sense that sovereignty, sovereign power over people, territory and the state are coterminous, it's actually very rarely the case, because people's rights belonged to Huijia, but at the same time, the city was a form of state that regulated access to the city itself, and the territory itself was flexible and remade. It makes us think about how sovereignty works in the context of Europe's migration crisis, where we know from the time when Mohamed Bouazizi set himself alight in Sidi, in Tunisia in 2010, to Merkel opening the borders in Germany in 2015, we saw the mass increase of people trying to move north into Europe with extraordinary political consequences. And I don't want to trivialize that moment of political action by Merkel in a sense, but I do want to contextualize it a little bit. If you look at the Frontex data for the time, even at the height or the near height of the migration crisis in 2014, the official data, and there are problems with this data, so I don't want to overstate either. If you look at the numbers that move north to Germany in 2014, officially at least, are about 403,000 within the EU and 416,000 outside the EU. The UK, not dissimilar. The point I want to make is that whilst the world was making a thing of the photogenic horrors of the people moving from wrecked Syria and other parts of North Africa and other points of the compass, we also were seeing the reconstruction of Europe post-2008, the significant movements from the European South, from Greece, Italy, Spain, Portugal. And those mobilities took place where people moved within a regime of sort of European sovereignty and made claims in the right to dwell. But at the same time, as they moved to the north, it was the case that they frequently moved to welfare states, which were contributory in their nature. So their access to the city itself was slightly regulated. It was, in a sense, partial citizenship. So it's clear that mobilization within the EU at the time were forms of migration, but they're not always classified as such within the structures of the European Union. Territory, state, and sovereignty are not coterminous. We see instead traces of longer and shorter histories. In the UK, what we saw was significant numbers of people regularized from Latin America in the south, particularly in Portugal and Spain, who after the shock of 2008 moved north to London and parts of London, as Cathy McElwain's work has displayed. But also we see sometimes longer histories echoing into the present. So around this time, the largest movements of people of Bangladeshi origin to the UK didn't come from Bangladesh, but came from Italy. People from parts of Italy struck by the crisis of 2008, who moved to the heart of the old empire. Which brings me to the fourth of my paradoxes, the post-colonial paradox of London, and how we think about some of those histories and the way in which they trouble the present. They trouble the present and are sometimes remembered, not always so. Because I've lived and worked for a large part of my life in this part of London, the old inner city of East London, the East End, where I've worked actually for 40 years and lived for over 30. And it is a part of London that is characterized by waves of migration. It's a part of London that at some times in the last 20 years has had simultaneously, perversely, the highest median income in Britain and simultaneously the lowest average income in Britain. In other words, a very small number of people who are incredibly affluent alongside some of the poorest folk in the country. Very high Gini coefficients of inequality. Because the landscape is patterned by a procession of settlements of migrant flows that did claim access to the city, that did claim the right to the city, but only just because initially there were forms of overt racism that resulted in forms of racist murder. There were forms of racial attacks that actually scared people out of living in some parts of that part of London. And so in this context, we need to ask, what is remembered? What's forgotten? We are here because you are there. That was the cry of the anti-racist movement of the 1980s. How do the British remember the Raj? Sylhet was once ruled by the UK. Sylhetis came to Britain originally to the East End to the docks. But how do the British remember? What sorts of post-colonial melancholia shapes this memory? More straightforwardly, what happens when we think about when territory and sovereignty shift their geographies over time? How do people once told they were citizens of the empire react when they find their British passports suddenly have less rights associated with them than they once thought? What happens when people are told that they are French citizens from Martinique, but are subjected to police brutality in the banlieue? How do we remember the traces of colonial power in most Northern European states? The global outreach of territory and sovereignty superimposed on the histories of slavery in Jamaica, Barbados, Suriname, or Guadeloupe. The reality is that as people made a space for themselves in the city who were Bangladeshi, some of the squats turned into formalized associations, housing associations that created a small stream of housing and dwelling explicitly for Bangladeshi folk. At the same time, as the state apparatus was gradually penetrated, there was a beginnings of trying to get access to state-provided council housing, not least an attempt, a strategy to gain access to that housing that was combated politically. A liberal democratic regime that controlled the borough for 8 years from the late 80s to the early 90s created 7 neighborhoods, bringing local government closer to the people, a participatory model of democracy, so called. But that participatory model of democracy created a geography that separated the west from the east of the borough. The west, where the Bangladeshis were concentrated, the east in the areas of Bow and the Isle of Dogs, Canary Wharf, the area that later saw the first election of a fascist councillor in Britain in the whole history of the United Kingdom. That area tried to remain white in the face of those changes by creating housing authorities that represented 7 local neighbourhoods. So you could apply for housing, but only in your original neighbourhood. So if you're in the west of the borough, you could only apply there. And they then also introduced policies of what were known as the sons and daughters policy, by which people could gain access to housing on the queue, because there's always has been more people who need and want social housing than there is supply. So people were allocated on the criterion of whether their mum or dad were born in the East End. It meant that if you had a mum or dad born in the East End under sons and daughters, you got a place. If you didn't, you had less chance. Obviously, this didn't favor people who had just arrived. Ironically, things have moved on slightly, but the point I would make, and I was part of the campaigns that campaigned against those forms of housing exclusion. And I was also part of a political regime, and in fact ended up running a political regime that actually ran the social housing system locally, and actually preferred to privilege a different set of criteria. They preferred to privilege a set of criteria based on need. Those people who are most disadvantaged should get housing first. Housing should be allocated according to a public good of social need, rather than a metaphor of the queue of waiting for housing. It became enormously politically contentious. But ironically, you see, I think the queue and the allocation according to need are both defensible moral values. In fact, again, paradoxically, it is now the case that where the borough is majority minority, schools are majority Bangladeshi, what we see is a return to appeals for a sons and daughters policy, but now coming from Bangladeshi British folk facing displacement through gentrification often, but trying to claim a vernacular right to the city based on the fact that they've now been there since the 70s and they're now second, third generation to use terms that are themselves hotly disputed in Britain. History turns, perspective turns, which is why how we think about that sense of what is remembered and what is not takes me to the fifth of the paradoxes I want to look at very briefly today, which is some work that we're doing under the Peak Urban program that was kindly mentioned earlier on in Colombia, in the city of Medellin, a city that has a very troubled history and a memory that embraces both the times in which Pablo Escobar and the narcos, which Medellin is most famous, so famous you can even have a narco tourism today, but the time in which the cartels and the militias fought each other and a civil war tore the country apart has not only not been forgotten, it still troubles today. It creates a trouble, but also it creates moments that are slightly counterintuitive. The mosaic on the left is in Moravia, one of the unauthorized settlements in the barrios where we're working, where actually Escobar created a football pitch to try and stop gang warfare that was going on in some of the informal settlements. The informal settlements in Medellin itself have often upgraded, almost gentrified in their own right, much as you've seen in cities like Istanbul in the last 50 years, with the Gecekondu there. But what has also happened is that as Venezuela has collapsed and Venezuelans moving to Brazil have been faced with racist violence and fairly grim times, huge movements have flowed into the cities of Colombia, including in Medellin. And in the memory of a time when Colombia and Venezuela were one state, there has been far less hostility evidence, although the COVID pandemic has changed this somewhat. But the point remains that there's an uncertain tension there. As Amos Oz says, in a way, sometimes we need to forget, right? Because there is a tension between peace and justice. Justice actually requires us, demands that we remember. It demands that the history's traces are made visible. But also peace requires compromises. In a sense, almost peace demands that we forget. It's a paradoxical switch of perspective that makes one think differently. It makes one think differently about how we make visible the strangest things in parts of the informal city. And the sixth of the seven paradoxes I want to talk about relates to work we're doing also at the moment. My colleague Bhawani Buswala, whose work has been carried out in the Busties of Delhi, where he actually grew up, where at a time of extraordinary change in India, those that have moved to what are seen as squatted settlements, colonies that are taxonomized by the state in terms of their eligibility for reform and settlement, are themselves actually characterized by an extraordinary precarity. But that precarity actually sits alongside a sense in which people occupy extraordinarily stigmatized spaces of Delhi, the spaces alongside the highways, the area alongside drains and rivers that are subject to flood, areas that are ecologically dangerous but are stigmatized spatially but interstitial and subject to what Sully Benjamin calls a sense of occupancy urbanism. And some of the people writing about these spaces include people like Asif Bayat, who describes them as a quiet encroachment of the ordinary. But more importantly, within the subaltern studies movement in India, the doyen, or one of the doyens of that movement, Partha Chatterjee, describes life in terms of the squatter settlements as being part of a political society, something that he juxtaposes as not civil society, precisely because it represents the ways in which people make claims for recognition of their humanity. They make claims to the right to the city. They make claims on the right to space in the city, but they make claims legally. Ironically, in terms of some of the work we've been doing, one of the things we've been following are the legal cases where people try to make their settlement visible to the courts to oppose forms of disruption and resettlement, precisely because the courts take a long time. So the courts are friends, and the courts act in the name of an Indian constitution, which proclaims the universality of humanity. The claim is to a constitution and an imagined India, which creates a sense of political society, not civil society. It actually creates an imperative to make yourself visible, notwithstanding the context in which we might think about how the consequences of that play for those people who are subsequently displaced. It takes me to the seventh and final paradox I want to draw on, which is how this interplay of visibility and invisibility plays out. And it plays out in cities like Istanbul, work done by someone who is a former PhD student of mine, now an academic in Turkey, Christian Beal, looked at the space of Kumkapi, a neighborhood where there were 3 separate circulations of migrants. There were people there are now lots of people there from Syria. But a few years ago, in particular, what one saw as Istanbul had boomed over 20 years was there were new labor flows from across Africa to service the unskilled labor, but also other niche labor demands of the city of Istanbul, frequently there under the radar of the state itself. There were also what were known as suitcase migrants, back and forth from the stands, taking the former Soviet republics that were sites of trade between Istanbul and the East, which actually created people that came and go. But alongside that, of course, were massive populations of transit migrants, people who were in Istanbul, but waiting determined by certain forms of immobility, whether it's the EU regimes of deals done with Turkey itself, or whether it's the hidden borders of Fortress Europe and the Schengen zone. So these form and create different logics. They form, in a sense, and this is the point, a dwelling politics of migration that create autonomous rationalities, separate and plural moral worlds, separate worlds alongside each other within the spaces of the city. They're spaces that are actually far less different to contemporary London or Berlin or Paris than we sometimes think. And one of the things I argue is that much of the writing of cities of the global south can actually highlight and illustrate the ways we think differently or could think differently about the workings of the cities of the global north. The Bangla town that we see in East London today is part of a city whose present is massively contested. It's part of a city in London that's, I think, best characterized by Salman Rushdie in a novel who said of London that Otto Kohn on his hobby horse had led his bored family to the table. London is the locus classicus of impossible realities. Lives that have no business mingling, sit by one another side by side on the bus. One universe on a zebra crossing is caught for an instant, blinking like a rabbit in the headlamps of a motor vehicle, which in an entirely alien continuum is to be found as long as that's all, they pass in the night, jostling on a tube, raising their hats in some hotel corridor. It's not that bad. But if they meet, it's uranium and plutonium. Each makes the other decompose. Boom. There's a sense in which, in the 7 paradoxes I've tried to show to you, that in each of them, moral dilemmas, political imperatives, and horizons of possibility depend on how they are made visible through geographies of mobility and the temporal rhythms of the city. So in the concluding section of what I want to say in a few minutes is, I want to argue for a recognition of both the agonisms that constitute the political imagination and the contradictions we all live by every day. Once we may have thought that these contradictions were subject to a dialectical succession of thesis, antithesis, synthesis. After spending 40 years in politics, in campaigns, in academic life, and in running part of a city, I'm not so sure. There's a long-standing productivity of thinking, theorizing, and imagining that takes the Utopian as its register of voice. the sense that there is an alternative, another world is possible, and that we should aspire to the highest moral standards. It may be because I was educated by Jesuits until beyond the key age of 7, but it is also the case that alongside the utopian, I subscribe to some sense also of the venality of humanity, alongside the propensity for enlightenment, ethos, and the broadest appeals to hospitality. In the abstract, we need to consider the centrality of intergenerational ethics historically, relational ethics geographically, the complexity and plurality of property rights, the multitude of the plural moral orders in Rushdie's city in London, or for that matter, how we think about Amsterdam, Berlin, Paris, Rome, the complexity and plurality of property rights and the multitude of moral orders, the importance of provincializing identity politics. But I do have a difficulty with certain kinds of implicit teleology, whether rooted in Marxian historical certainties, technocratic determinism, or Whiggish optimism. I think the world is slightly less certain, unfortunately, than that. There are at times challenges of geographical generalities that ignore the rooting and landing of knowledges and expertise. There are at times challenges of geographical specificities that do not understand, as the great post-colonial critic C.L.R. James once said about cricket, that it is important to link what happens beyond a boundary to make sense of the rules of the game within it. In this context, the invocation of le droit à la vie can occasionally provide an alibi for inaction, naming the political and yet never having time for politics, and how the bogeymen of the neoliberal, the capitalist, or the state can also at times invoke the ethical without troubling the incommensurable dilemmas, trade-offs, and compromises of everyday life. The famous sociologist C. Wright Mills once characterized his discipline as capturing the ability to translate personal troubles into public issues. This translation of personal troubles into public issues demands an understanding of the modes of translation, the architecture of the problem it defines, and the forms of knowledge and expertise that are brought together to make sense of the problem addressed. But it also demands a practical facility to translate backwards the analytical diagnosis, prognosis, and prescription that addresses the problem into the worlds we inhabit that are culturally mediated, historically and geographically specific. And so it is with the contemporary so-called migration crisis. I think practically this in turn demands first-hand engagement with the lives of those on the move, understanding in detail from up close. It also demands a critical distance that reviews such data, as academics sometimes talk about their work, reviews such data, linking proximate detail to bigger stories and global trends, bridging micro and macro, detail and metonym in the best ethnographic tradition. This in turn implies a process of continuous back and forth, endless iterations of theory and praxis, an agile social theory. But without such agility, we will never understand in good faith the empirical detail and creative extemporization strategies and tactics of the everyday and migrant life. But neither will we link such detail to the urgency of the contemporary configuration of the political or the future of the 21st century city. What does this mean for the three key themes of today's conference? Decolonial commoning practices, the rights to the city, and intersectional spatial justice. Most straightforwardly, I gently suggest that the first two notions are simultaneously plausible and contradictory, paradoxical if you like. Valuable directions of travel, but also ideals that may lay their own bear traps in terms of shaping city futures. Decolonial commoning practices sustain the agonisms of the distance between Arendt and Agamben, a space in which the pragmatics of everyday humanism might outweigh the imperatives of theoretical purity. I suppose, in short, I believe that second generations migrants born in Italy, the Netherlands, or the United Kingdom, regardless of the legality of their parents' residence, should definitely have full access to citizenship rights. I'm supportive of utopian thinking, less convinced by all the maxims of the no border movement, while simultaneously arguing for a far greater recognition of the contributions and rights of those to the places in which they have just arrived. The right to the city is incredibly useful politically, analytically, but at times it sustains the myth of correspondent sovereignty and territory, coterminous sovereignty, territory, and state. The sense that sovereign power corresponds with territorial governance. It doesn't, rarely does. It also sustains the contradiction between the rights that are claimed by competing voices and the principles of even the most participatory democracy. Neither of these conclusions excuses the inhumane treatment of the 21st century Mediterranean, the shibboleths of populist nationalism, the post-colonial path dependencies of cultivated underdevelopment, or the territorial exploitations of uneven development. They instead invoke a notion of intersectional spatial justice that takes time and space as constitutive of the very notion of the good city and the just society. The temporal and the spatial are part of the way the world is, not just calibrations of the way the world is measured. The perspectival dance between closeness and distance, past, presents, and futures are sewn into the way we need to think about a better world in paradoxical spaces. Theoretically, this is closer to what the German scholar Walter Benjamin described as a constellatory epistemology, a very academic term. His close friend Theodor Adorno put it slightly differently, slightly more simply, when he suggested in his work that his quote was, "Distance is not a safety zone, but a field of tension. Critical distance of the academic or the politician or the activist. Critical distance is not a safety zone, but a field of tension." Many years ago, I set up and now chair an arts charity in the part of East London where I've lived and worked for many decades. The East End is classically a paradoxical space, characterized by both extreme forms of racism, inspiring alliances that have challenged racist poisons, a paradoxical space of both great inequalities and remarkable solidarities. At a time of the poisonous British Brexit nationalism we've seen, resurgent populism across Europe, and multiple tensions of the multicultural settlement, we tried to address this by speaking to the East End street through a mural that captured the pandemic moment. 200 nationalities, one National Health Service in the pandemic. Thank you very much for letting me speak to you tonight. I hope this may capture something of the spirit of what I've said.
Wonderful, Michael. Thank you so much for such a rich and thought-provoking talk. This is a great starting point for our discussion, I would say. Thank you again. You can turn off your video for a moment and mute yourself, and stop sharing your screen, please.
Yeah.
Take your time.
How do I? Oh, here, stop share. There we go. Thanks.
And then you can mute yourself, please. And then I will ask Charis to put on his camera. Welcome, and you're very welcome to give your brief response to Michael Key's talk.
Hello, thank you very much for this evening gathering, and responding and reflecting on Michael Keith's very provocative speech. I was thinking the very famous Spivak's paper, Can the Subaltern Speak? Which explores the possibility of subalterns, the population subordinated to hegemonic structures of class, race, gender, sexual orientation, to speak on themselves. However, in the case of newcomers' right to the city, I think that some more the questions could be added. For example, can the newcomer dream and hope? Can the newcomer cry, protest, and demonstrate? Can the newcomer's claims to be heard? Can the newcomer's body inhabit the city? Can the newcomer have access to housing, of health, education, work? And if we discuss about Spivak, of course, intersectional way of thinking could add some more questions. How can be feminized the right to the city? Actually, Henri Lefebvre missed the gender in his analysis. And finally, how can we recreate or reimagine a decolonial and intersectional right to the city? And at this point, I would like to share with you some thoughts from an experience of a single woman whom lived for half a year in a self-organized squat occupied building in Thessaloniki in Greece, very close to the borders with Macedonia. And she said that I am from Iran. I came from Idomeni, the makeshift settlement in the borders with between Greece and Macedonia, when the borders were closed, to the squat in December 2016, a few days before the evacuation of the Idomeni settlement. In the squat, I had my own room, which meant a lot to me, since I was the only woman alone there. There were several men in the squat, and all the other women were with their family. On the first night, I slept for 12 hours. Hadn't had a good night's sleep in the last 3 months. And after a long time feeling stressed and under constant pressure, I immediately felt secure, and I liked that very much. That was the crucial thing for me. I didn't speak any English back then. I always needed a translator. I was on my own, and despite all this, I felt safe and comfortable. The people at the squat spoke in different languages. They were from various backgrounds, countries, and cultures. Men were ill and run down. This diversity was hard to deal with at first, and I want to underline the importance of having people of different origin to do the houseworks together. In general, it was a significant endeavor for coexistence and cohabitation, and I think we succeed to a great extent. Our everyday life was full of vitality. It was not about mere survival or about sticking to certain habits. It was much more interesting and joyful than the usual everyday life of an ordinary person. We did not have a boss. We did not have to wake up every morning and obey the orders of some superior. Nobody ordered us what to do or not to do. Nobody repressed or exploited us. We made decisions about everything together. We organized concerts, discussions, meetings, and demonstrations in the center of the city. Finally, the squat was evicted, and I cried a lot. And that was the first time I cried from the moment I arrived in Greece. It was a sentimental thing for me. There were so many memories. When I watched the demolition of the building by the bulldozers with all the personal belongings of the people who used to stay there, I was shocked. It was as if they were trying to kill all the memories of the big and small moments people had spent in that building. That's it. Actually, yes, this young lady allowed me to share her thoughts, and I think it's very useful and very provocative for this event in a more global context. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Charis, for this wonderful response. You can stay here. You don't have to turn your camera off, and I will welcome Marca to the virtual stage. Welcome, Marca.
Hello, hi. Okay, well, I will try and stick to my 5 minutes. Anybody who knows me knows I have a lot to say usually. I'm trying to turn on a light over here. So I really wanted to thank Michael for this talk. I found it very beautiful. I found it very moving. This is going to sound a little bit strange, but to me it was a talk that really was something that were the words, the story, the narratives, of somebody who loves the city. And that came across to me very strongly. And I think that has a lot to do with the different kinds of facets from which you've really engaged with the city over the last decades. So I'm coming to this. I hadn't read your paper, so I was challenged in terms of thinking about where can I engage this immediately in the aftermath. And there were a few things that came to mind. One is I was thinking about the way we're using the term newcomer. So it's in the title and it's come along several times. And that question of who is the newcomer. So it makes sense to call migrants to the city newcomer, but I think in a certain sense at the same time, or at least I'm wondering what you would think about that, aren't we all newcomers in two different kinds of ways? On the one hand, the European, the cities of Western Europe are newcomers to what is a world of already globalized colonial, post-colonial cities that were multicultural and multinational in that, imperial fashion long before those of Europe. And it's Europe now is catching up to the rest of the world in its experiencing of that kind of a globalization. And then at the same time, aren't we all newcomers at the moment that we're co-creating, the city yet to come? So none of us truly know what this city to come will take shape, are we not all new to it? And is that not something which binds us? Second question is, at different moments, you use the terms paradoxical and agonistic. And then at the same time, as I'm thinking about how you use them, it seemed to me that when you were talking about these paradoxical kinds of situations, that really had a humanizing effect in capturing, some of these complexities. While agonistic, coming from Chantal Mouffe, that's something that's a kind of politics that's just on this side of violence, right? The end point of the agonistic is where violence begins, and the recognition of the agonistic is a way of channeling irresolvable differences in a fashion that prevents them from becoming violent. So it seems to me that there's this kind of tension also between the paradoxical and the agonistic. And I was wondering what you think of that, because this came back time and again in your talk. And I think it's something you might recognize, that there's a kind of tension there. And then the final thing is the question of the utopian. And so sometimes as you're talking, it feels as if you're utopian despite yourself. And sometimes and at the same time, you're making a very, very clear critique of any kind of simple utopianism. But it seemed to me like the reason that we hang on to the utopian is not, sometimes it can be to have a certain kind of truth, but it's also what it made me think of is I did work quite a while ago. My dissertation was on Dorothy Day, co-founder of the Catholic Worker, and it was an anarchistic Catholic social movement that in which, rather than sort of helping the poor out of your middle class security, instead what you did was you went and you lived together with the poor, and you create community with the marginal, not just the poor, but the mad and the sick. So there were these communities that were created within cities that were anarchistic, Catholic inspired, and that brought together people from very different walks and backgrounds. And she did this over decades under very difficult conditions at moments. And so people would really say to her, well, what's the point of this? Why are we doing this? And so she talked about the long history of different kinds of radical and progressive movements, and that these would stretch across generations. So that hope is a kind of hope beyond the horizon that is a compass. It's an orientation point. It's something that gives meaning to the present, a present that is hopeless. And she was very much drawing on the slogan of the Wobblies, these radical union movements in the American West, the IWW, that the point of what we do is to build a new society in the shell of the old. So I was wondering if you could, if that would be something that would resonate with the idea that you have of post-colonial commoning. Thank you very, very much. I really appreciated it.
Thank you so much, Marca, for your response. Michael, please come back to the stage. And Maria, you're very welcome to also turn on your microphone, and you can all unmute so we can discuss directly, and you can start talking whenever you feel like it. And for those of you at home, please start raising your questions in the Q&A so I can read them and incorporate them in the discussion whenever it's possible. Michael, would you like to briefly respond to your respondents, to some of the points they made?
No, I don't wonder. I think you've heard enough of me mostly, but there's very kind comments. And for Harry, I suppose I would say, I would just say I lived next door to a big squat that was there for a long time. And when it was moved on, people used to come back and commemorate his existence every year. And it was very moving, right? But when you say, you know, can the newcomer not sleep, dream, protest, and so on, I would say, of course. I mean, absolutely, of course. And it almost becomes worrying that we should even ask that question, right? So presence is part of a story. Precarity, which is what we describe when we are talking about that story, is something that is objectionable in various ways, right? I mean, and so whilst there are moments of, well, many moments, actually I tried to say in the talk, of extraordinary extemporizations of people in the face of. The writer Achille Mbembe talks about a sense of the convivial that is always in the face of and in spite of absolute horror. And that sense of the conviviality of London, someone like Paul Gilroy has drawn on similarly, and people take it as being some sort of happy clappy existence. But certainly, and I mean, Achille's work in particular is, you know, it's in spite of, in the face of. And that is something that I think is important to recognize, but it's not necessarily something to celebrate per se, which kind of slightly worries me. But in terms of Marca's points, I think they're very, firstly, for both of you, thank you, but particularly, I guess, Marca, thank you. They're very kind, your comments, and very perceptive to the point, because I agree most straightforwardly. But what I would say is I've actually written elsewhere about, I think we arrive in the present, right? So I think we arrive in time as much as we arrive in space. This was never made clearer to me than when my Lao Shi, my teacher of Mandarin in China, said to me that when I was first in China, there were 2 tubes in the whole of Beijing. And that was in 2007. By 2008, after the Olympics, there were 18 tubes, which meant that your mobility across the city was reinvented. The city becomes new. And there's a long tradition of thinking about the city as being an excess. So we make sense of the city by editing out, by subtracting as much as adding, in a way. And we do that through time. So I spent a large part of my life doing research in a very small part of London. And I always say that I think I tend to claim I know more about it than most other people, but I still don't know very much, right? After several decades, because that is the nature of urban life. It changes so fast. Flux is so rapid, but arriving in time is quite important. And you're absolutely right about the paradoxical and the agonistic and the utopian. That there is, I mean, without being too obtuse in this audience, but I mean, if one were to go in a theoretical direction, you know, the agonistic appeals to a Schmittian political vocabulary, which is deeply problematic for where it came from and where it led to in the past. And that's what that sense of the agonistic is, not without deep problems, and it is slightly different maybe from the paradoxical. But I suppose one of the things I also signaled is that we live through contradictions, which is, I'm saying very shortly, I guess I'm a utopian on a Tuesday and a Thursday, and maybe less so on the other days of the week, right? I mean, because yeah, these are things that sit as tensions that we live through. I guess I could say more, but I think I've said more than enough, please.
But thank you so much. It is indeed, for me as well, I'm a political sociologist. I forgot to introduce myself, not that has any importance, but in this case, I would really like to bring in some of the ideas that I got from your talk as well, Michael, because I was really struck about what you said about democracy and the quote that you gave, and how democracy in a way is exclusionary by definition, because not everyone can belong to the same demos. And I'm curious to learn more, a little bit more. So any one of you could answer also how you discuss this or bring this in the workshop today. Do you also think that true newcomers' rights to the city demand a new form of self-organization? Is democracy a form in which inclusive cities where newcomers have all the rights and indeed also have the right to cry, to protest, to be themselves and not be seen as outsiders? Is that possible in a democratic society?
Do you want me to come back?
Yes, you're welcome to respond, but Maria or Marca or Garius can...
Maybe the others would want to come back first, and then I can come
Maria,
back.
perhaps you would like to say something about this?
Sure. Yeah, democracy, of course, it's much debated, and we're not going to go into the nitty-gritty of this. It's a general audience, but I think what is often forgotten, particularly in public rhetoric invoking democracy, is that the ideal type democracy was always about agonistic politics. It never was. It never was about sitting around together nicely in a table and building consensual politics. So there is currently a lot of a tendency to collapse democracy with consensual politics, and this is, I think, where most of the confusion and actually very bad policies coming out of this kind of so if we think of democracy as agonistic politics, yeah, as the place where power is continuously shifting territory, where everything's at stake continuously. It's not in kind of firm, institutionalized forms of power, but it's continuously shifting forms of power. Then we can talk about democratic policies and practices, but I don't think there is much we can do with the notion of democracy when we talk about politics, and particularly politics of migration. It is in the claiming a stake in the agonistic politics that migration flows bring and challenge all levels of territorial institutions. And that has nothing to do with Western democracy as we know it today. So I find it an unhelpful framework to think and act upon what's happening today.
Marca, would you like to respond?
I think I agree with what Maria is saying, in the sense that the political is always up for grabs, which is in part what I think is the notion that the political is always agonistic, I think, is certainly the case. But I think it's also the case that what we see on a very micro scale sometimes is the way in which a settlement that at one time looked sensible suddenly becomes problematic. So even on a very, very small scale, in the estates of London in the 1980s, a left-wing progressive London government tried to open up the running of the estates to the people that ran the estates. And so what they did was they had forms of lettings that meant that the tenants themselves were involved with the choices of the lettings. And what that meant in turn was that the estates that were run by London government actually tended to become more segregated than the estates that were run by the local councils at a sub-city level, because they turned into sites of power that were captured. And the nature of the agonistic is that there is always, at every single geographical scale and historical moment, I think, a tension about what is up for grabs, which is why I think in the context, the one thing I'm not quite sure whether you were saying, Maria, is I do think this plays out very strongly in the context of migration on a day-to-day basis, precisely because the very nature, the grain of urban life is precisely about that tension between recognition and distribution, the kind of tensions that are themselves agonistic, but are part of the way we structure our relations to people that are other. I think what becomes more problematic is the way that people reify migration as being in some way much more different than some things that are actually quite mundane about how we think about strangers and our relationship to strangers who arrive and who arrive in places that are proximate.
Marca,
because that's not always about migration, but it does create a kind of a political domain.
Thank you, Michael. Marca, you wanted to add something?
Well, I thought the reason it is because I think in some ways I'm maybe a bit more positive or optimistic about democracy, but in the sense that the way I see it, the tensions that we're having with democracy right now are because we developed democracy within the nation state form. So at a high imperial moment, right? So we became democratic at the moment that we also were slave owning, that we also were, ravaging the world. So you could, leave your nation state and go off and butcher people and then come back and be a good Democrat. And it wasn't a problem. And nowadays, for a whole range of reasons, right, it's becoming, that's no longer possible, right? The silos have been broken through. And so, precisely for that reason, that because we were there, right, we are here now. And so I think there is no clear line between the democratic and the colonial, and we have to figure out, okay, how do you do democracy in what is becoming, a global society? And we don't yet know how to do that. But I do see all different kinds of efforts, precisely in, like, I look at the sanctuary movement in New York City, for example. And that's very much, entangled collaboration between non-citizens and citizens and politicians and activists, all of whom are creating, through very democratic processes, transformations that are very impressive and exhausting and difficult. And, it's through democratic processes, that somebody like me, just that a woman now is in academia, when 100 years ago I could not have been, or that slavery was abolished, or, and there, so I have, in terms of the options that we have, democracy, right, seems the best of the worst. Relative to the other possibilities we have, because democracy has not only that agonistic aspect, but also the one of persuasion. And I think, thinking along, the lines of tensions and paradoxes, that's one of the things that does make democracy still viable, is that the persuasive component of it, through self-sacrifice even, right, which lends legitimacy to social movements that have a hope in a future that is not yet here, really does create change.
Thank you. Yeah, so this is also something that struck me, as something else that struck me in your talk, Michael, and that is also referred to in one of the questions. We already received some wonderful questions regarding combination. So Javier Liza, I hope I pronounce it right, Liza Zaburu, asks, is interested especially in the combination of identity, memory, and cultural heritage. He asks if these elements are basic components of a person's sane dimension, is there then a role for the guest city to help newcomers adapt while having their own identities being recognized one way or the other? So I would like to combine this with a question I myself had about memory. And you said that, and this, I really like this quote, I will use it much more often, that justice requires us to remember, while peace requires us to forget. But what role does memory, cultural heritage, then play if we see ourselves, if like Marca, we are all in a way newcomers, living in the present, creating the city in the here and now. How does memory help us to create a sane environment for newcomers? Michael, could you respond?
Yes, sorry.
Perhaps then please, Charis, perhaps you can also respond later.
I think the power of memory is the power to dream, but it's also the power to deceive. So it is a very dual-edged thing in all sorts of ways. But I suppose what I was trying to suggest is that memory is incredibly important in thinking through just the basic everyday life of journeys that involve moving from somewhere to somewhere else, that involve moving through time from somewhere to somewhere else. And they're the things that take place always in the present. History is interesting in a way because it is past, it is finished. Memory always takes place in the present. If we are remembering, we are remembering now, for all of its distortions and contortions. And I think in the context of thinking about what that means for people that arrive, it always strikes me that Jacques Derrida talks about the need for what he calls an ethics of hospitality, which is a sense that if we accept the irreducible difference between all of us, part of what we need to do is acknowledge, respect, recognize, whilst at the same time not sacrificing that sense of engagement in debates that are agonistic, that do involve sometimes very difficult choices. What I find sometimes slightly difficult about some of the human rights angles of discussion is that ultimately there is no point appealing to rights unless we are clear about where those rights are arbitrated or judged when people deny them. And whatever we think about, however supportive we are of the claims that are made in the names of rights, we have to always have our eyes open on the courts in which the rights are adjudicated, rejected, or sometimes completely wiped out altogether.
Yes, this also relates, the last point that you make about the UN human rights also relates to the question that was raised by Ayam Dalal. She wonders, and perhaps Charis, you can respond to this one. Why dwelling, the right to dwell? If you can elaborate a little bit more on that and how this is translated in human rights, or what she I think it's a she. Yeah, so why is dwelling so important within the migration discourse, and how does this relate to UN human rights? It's a
Michael or me?
Charis, could you respond to this one, please?
Yes, sure. Yeah, actually, I think that maybe we can replace dwelling with housing, the right to housing. And of course, yes, it's a key word in every international, national statement, agreement, especially the UNHCR released many times guidelines for the right to housing. And yes, actually, I think that it is also very useful to combine with the previous question about memory. House, first of all, is social relations. First of all is the people that we are close, we feel proximity, we have memories, we have also expectations. Hope is the memory that desires, the famous quote of Balzac. So always people try to recreate houses in this term of social relations. And if we lost our beloved person, then also the house is empty. So yes, I think that always we try to recreate houses, and the very interesting is how we can create houses through commoning practices, collective houses. To how can we imagine cohabitation, togetherness, to imagine dwelling and housing beyond the private property, but as a space of social relations, as inhabitants, and not only as a structure. And usually the official structures, the state, the international organization focused on the structure as the walls, the containers in the camps. And always, all of these are very homogeneous, the same things. We had some excellent presentations during our workshop in the morning, but every human relation is different. So how can all these differences fit in the same homogeneous white color container all over the so-called democratic world? And in this, and I'm going back to the first question about democracy, I think that the white container in a refugee camp is the emblematic and symbolic failure of the democracy. People, in the container, they do not have rights of participation, to vote, to freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, participation in decision making. So the house as a social relation or as a commoning practice, I think it's a very, very crucial point to think the newcomers right to the city.
Thank you, and that was really incredible how you tied all the three questions together, and this makes me really think of how valuable your workshop also must have been today. And Maria, I wanted to ask you, because we have to wrap it up, because it's almost 4 minutes to 8, so time is really flying when you're having great discussions and great company. Maria, what is you as the initiator of this topic of tonight's NIAS talk, but also of the workshop today? What would you take as your main takeaway from today?
Yeah. Thank you. It's humbling, really, and it's very cavalier to make any final conclusions. I'll try to give you the cue. Michael's talk was really beautiful and moving, and the interventions from Haris and Marca. What I think we can take collectively, perhaps as a way forward, is this tension between the everyday, the lived experience, and the institutions, the policies, the geopolitics of it. And I think all of us here and in the workshop grapple with that also methodologically in our research. Perhaps one way of trying to bring them together, I would like to think, is storytelling. Because when we do ethnographic work, this is what we do, we collect stories, but also stories, and I come back to this question of memory, stories are about memories. And if we agree with many anthropologists that memory is what provides objects with their past, their present, and their future, then memory is a way of recreating history as well. So history is not necessarily something in the past. It's alive. So as more memories are made in cities by newcomers, by new perspectives, they also enable us to enrich and change the history of our cities and hopefully change the future directions of our cities. So yeah, I would like to think of our work, academic work, but also hopefully the work of insurgent citizenship is about enabling these stories to be told, to be brought, new memories to be made, to recreate history and perhaps a new future. It's a lot of work to ask of everybody. It's something we can only do through commoning practices and collectively. It's not a one person or one movement or a one community thing. So.
Thank you so much, and thank you all for joining us. And actually, Maria, this was a wonderful bridge to the annual NIAS lecture that will take place on the 21st of April, which will be on the politics of history making in the present, how politicians, policymakers, but also activists, citizens create memories or heritage sites and imbue them with meaning and value, and how this is used in a political way to segregate or to polarize, but also to bring groups together in the city. So you are all very welcome to join the annual NIAS lecture. On the 16th or 18th, the date has to be confirmed, we will have another, I think, kind of related topic on knowledge production in the 19th century, and by our fellow Lindsay Brown, and he will elaborate on how maps were created and how types of knowledge were represented in the maps and our present knowledge on the African continent. So there's so much that we can still learn, and I'm very happy to have had Maria Kaika with us, Michael Keith. I'm very grateful to have been able to welcome you. Marca Valenta, Savderoglou, thank you so much all for your...
Thank you, and NIAS and SPO25, thank you.
You're very welcome. And thank you all at home for your wonderful questions, for your engagement, and for coming. And see you next time. Bye-bye. Bye.